Hello and welcome to Academic Matters at LaSalle University. My name is Brian Goldstein and I'm the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs. I'm here today with Dr. Kevin Grauke, Associate Professor in the Department of English here at LaSalle University. Kevin, welcome.
Thanks.
Can you describe your professional journey? Where were you born and raised, and how did you end up in your chosen field of English?
I was born in Texas, in Dallas specifically, and grew up there, went to high school and community college there. Went to University of Texas at Austin for my BA in English. Then I got my MFA in Texas State University. That's where I studied fiction writing. And at that point, I then went to SUNY Buffalo to get my PhD in American literature. And I've always loved books. It's a cliche, but you know, my love of reading early on and writing stories certainly led me in that direction as I got older.
So is that something that was fostered in you or something you just took to naturally, and how did it show itself through, say, grade school and high school?
It was both. My parents were both college educated, or they are, they're still alive, and books were all over the house, and they were always encouraging me to read, and I read lots of their books, even at a young age, and would take their books to school and read them. And they were very encouraging of that, and very encouraging of any sort of creative work, which I'm very grateful for.
So were you also writing at that age, in addition to reading books perhaps older than would be expected for your age?
I was writing stories, and I would do, length of stories was a big deal when you're a little kid, and so I was very proud when I could write a 10 or 12 page story on notebook paper, and I would make covers and artwork, and I did that a lot. So.
Did you make your parents edit your work and grade it for you too? Or
No,
they
didn't, but they photocopied it, and I still have copies of some of my early science fiction and vampire stories.
So did you know from that age that being a college professor maybe was something that was in your future? And how did you come to that?
Not at all, honestly. That's what I enjoyed doing, but it wasn't something that I had in mind at all. And I still didn't have it in mind, even when I was an undergraduate. I was an English major, but I really had no idea what I might do with that, other than I had a notion that I would probably go to law school. And so after I graduated with a BA, I worked at a law firm for a couple of years as an administrative assistant, and that kind of cured me of my desire to go to law school. And I was attempting to lead, arguably a more practical life, but instead I went back to school, and because there wasn't, I decided at that point that I really did want to dedicate myself to writing and reading literature, but teaching was still not on the radar necessarily. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to go into teaching. I actually I was terribly shy and was afraid of speaking in public, and when I was a graduate student, I was a teaching assistant, and I gave it a shot, and I immediately really enjoyed teaching, and I've been teaching every semester practically since then.
So how did you end up coming to LaSalle?
I was working on my dissertation in 2000, and I went on the job market too early with the dissertation not finished, and I did fairly well on the job market, but I really didn't. I actually got a few offers, but I turned them down. None of the schools were a good fit, and then in 2003, I interviewed with LaSalle and came to LaSalle, and I immediately fell in love with LaSalle and the people here, and I had no qualms about accepting the job offer when I got it in 2003. I really liked the people in the Department of English. I really liked the students that I encountered. I liked the atmosphere of the school. There was something that really drew me. Some of it was just kind of intangible to me at the time, and I've got to learn more about LaSalle, obviously, in the 11 years that I've been here. LaSalle distinguished itself from the other schools that I'd interviewed at tremendously.
And I know that your journey has taken you, you talked about being from Austin, being at UT Austin,
Mm-hmm.
you've been to San Marcos and Buffalo and now to Philadelphia. So I'm curious as to what influence different places and different geographies, people's cultures have had on your career, on your writing, on your teaching, and your interaction with students.
Well, it's been interesting to go to different universities in different regions. Moving around, I think, has affected my writing more than anything. I didn't start writing about Texas, which I tend to do a lot of, until I moved off to Buffalo, and then even more so once I moved here. I think it helped getting away from where I had grown up to see it a little more objectively and to think about it in comparison to other places like Buffalo and Philadelphia, which are both very different from where I grew up. And as far as teaching, I don't think there's a whole lot of difference where I've taught. Students are pretty similar across geographic regions, at least from my experience.
So let's talk more about the students here and also the classes you teach. So what have you tended to teach? And I won't quite ask you what you most enjoy teaching, but what classes have you tended to teach here?
Well, what I tend to teach most is English 305, which is fiction writing, introductory fiction writing. I tend to teach that, if not every semester, every other semester. And I teach a lot of the core courses. I teach the introductory class to literature, and I teach composition, and I teach, my PhD is in 19th century American literature, so I do tend to teach American literature, whether it's 19th century or contemporary, because I do focus a lot on contemporary American fiction as well.
So what's your philosophy of teaching? What are you conscious about as you walk into the classroom every day?
Well, I'm conversation and discussion are very important to me. A lot of interaction between me and the students amongst each other. I don't like to lecture for long periods of time. I want to have some give and take. And also, I was happy at the University of Texas at Austin. I got a good education there, but I never had any interaction with my professors at all. Most of them had several teaching assistants. My Shakespeare class, I think, was a class of 600 people. And so it was a very kind of anonymous education experience, at least in terms of my interaction with my professors. And I wanted, I've enjoyed the small classes of LaSalle where I can really dedicate myself to my students in a way that professors didn't do, when I was an undergrad. So the one-on-one interactions with students is important to me in terms of me, I think, educating each student as well as I can. And clearly it's important to them to know that I'm someone that they can come see and we can talk and work through things that maybe are not clear in class.
Great. Thank you. This is Academic Matters at LaSalle University. We'll be right back.
Oh, hey, bud. Where are you headed?
Just gonna hang out.
With Gary and Todd?
Yeah?
I've been meaning to ask you, is there any drinking going on in this crowd?
No?
If any of your buddies ever pressure you to take a drink, just tell them you promised your dad you wouldn't. I'd do anything to keep you safe.
Okay, I will.
I hope this is working.
I promise. Love you too, Dad.
They really do hear you. For tips on what to say, visit underagedrinking.samhsa.gov.
You are now watching Salle TV.
You might feel like there's too many problems in the world, or that, you as a 15-year-old, 16-year-old can't really make a difference.
It's not always about you. It's not just one person. It's a group. It's a team.
Just that simple act is transforming someone else's life.
It's one of the best feelings in the world.
It'll just make you feel so good about yourself.
I'd do anything to convince you just to be a part of this.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
The American dream need not forever be deferred.
This is the richest and the most powerful country.
Welcome back to Academic Matters at LaSalle University. Our guest today is Dr. Kevin Grauke, Associate Professor in the Department of English. Before our break, you were talking about students, and you mentioned that you teach not only English majors, but also students who are taking English as part of their general ed or core requirements. How is it that you approach those two groups of students differentially, if you do?
I try not to make it. I try not to make too much of a difference between them. Although in the advanced upper division courses, that certainly does change because they've taken courses and have developed a foundation that the non-majors lack. But the non-majors are. I think everybody is prepared to a certain degree to study literature at a fairly introductory level. And you can get a lot out of it without getting into all sorts of technical jargon and terminology that we tend to inculcate our students with eventually in the major. But I think that non-majors, I frequently encounter non-majors who really do enjoy the English classes. Some of them even become English majors or minors because of my class or another class similar to that class in the core. And a lot of students just haven't had the experience with studying literature and the sort of pleasures it can bring.
So how do you embed that love of literature, but also bring an interpretive aspect to it? And sort of to follow up on that, my daughter, who's a high school junior, often says when she comes home from English class, how do they know that's what the author meant? Why are they interpreting it that way?
Right. Well, I think it's a good, I tend to start very generally to get reactions about a story or a poem or a play, and I take their reactions to it and then tend to draw them towards how the authors caused those sorts of feelings to be felt in them, and that the reason they feel this way is let's look at how the author drew this character or created this plot line or so forth, and we can examine it in terms of their visceral reaction to it.
So do you use that in your own writing? That is that approach? If not, talk about your approach to your own writing.
Well, I guess I don't intellectualize my writing like I do my teaching. I tend to it tends to become a more unconscious sort of approach, subconscious. I tend to be following gut instincts when I'm writing, at least initial drafts. In later drafts, I tend to get more intellectual in terms of looking at it objectively and critically, but I tend not to think in the sorts of terms that I use when we're dissecting a story in class.
How then, is there an intersection between your work as a writer and also a teacher, and how do they interact with one another?
Well, typically, I'm constantly reading contemporary fiction, and that's what I'll use in a lot of my courses where we're reading fiction. And I teach stories that impress me, that I admire, that I've learned from, and I think that feeds the teaching that I do. And those stories also instruct my writing. So, frequently the stories that I teach are stories that are working in two ways for me. They're helping me with my writing. They're helping me illustrate points to my students.
Talk more about what your approach is then to your own writing. What is your day like or week like in terms of your writing schedule?
Well, during the semester, it's hard to get much of a rhythm because my first duty is to my students, and being prepared and grading things in a timely fashion and having office hours and being on committees and so forth. And so my writing tends to be very choppy in terms of I squeeze it in when I can. Some weeks I get no writing done, other weeks I may be able to get a little more done. I tend to write at night, preferably. I don't particularly know how that came to pass. I think primarily because of little children in the house who've grown up, but when they were awake, I never got any writing done.
When kids are awake, we as parents don't get much of anything done.
No.
So is great writing learned or taught, or what's the combination? Can you teach somebody to be a great writer, or is it something that sort of comes more naturally and then you hone that skill?
I think it's a combination, but I think I think good writing can certainly be taught. I think it certainly helps if students come to the course being serious readers and having read a lot already. They tend to internalize all sorts of things that they haven't really been conscious of. In class, I try to just make them become conscious of things that when we're reading stories, we remain unconscious too, but we're affected by.
So both.
Yeah, both. For me, I was a serious reader, and I dabbled with writing, and I wanted to become a writer, but I really didn't know what I was doing until I got to grad school. So I certainly feel as if I benefited from teaching, and I hope that my students do as I mimic or model myself after my teachers.
So in a decade and a half of being at LaSalle, have you found that students' approach to reading and writing has changed over time?
Not substantially, other than the fact that electronic devices have changed the way students read. And I think that arguably they probably read more, if we're just counting words, they read more now than they ever did. They may not be reading books or novels or nonfiction any more than they were before, but they're reading more and they're writing more. I would say that Harry Potter and the Twilight series and so forth certainly, I think, created more interest in reading in general than the generations before. The generation before Harry Potter came to pass.
This is Academic Matters at LaSalle University. We'll be right back.
Oops. Uh-oh.
Get on top of it before they do. Every 24 minutes, tipped furniture or a falling TV sends an injured child to the emergency room. Preventing tip-over incidents is easy, inexpensive, and only takes 5 minutes. Learn how to secure your furniture and TVs to protect children at anchorit.gov.
Can I go to the sleepover?
Lucy, I want you to promise me something. If there's any drinking, I want you to say, no thanks, not my thing.
Mom.
I promise you, your real friends won't care. Deal?
I promise, Mom.
They really do hear you.
Did you pack your toothbrush?
For tips on how to start the talk, visit underagedrinking.samhsa.gov. A public service message from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration.
Welcome back to Academic Matters at LaSalle University. Our guest today is Dr. Kevin Grauke, Associate Professor in the Department of English. So Kevin, can you explain the process that you go through when you're starting a new work, not something that you're continuing to work on, but you're ready to start anew? What's that process like?
It's pretty slow to start. I keep a notebook, and usually I just write notes, and I don't necessarily have any idea what's going to germinate. I will write notes, and it's usually when I'm in the middle of something else. You know, I find the notebook particularly helpful when I'm working on something and directing all my attention to that. I'm still having thoughts about other things. I don't necessarily know their value, so I put them in the notebook, and then when I finish whatever I'm working on, I turn to the notebook and see what stands out. And sometimes I'm already mentally kind of building something as I'm working on something else. So I usually something's been kind of flowing through my brain off and on for weeks, sometimes months before I actually sit down and officially start. I tend to not want to officially start a story too soon. I tend to put it off as long as I can. Which I don't know if makes sense to people, but it feels right for me. If I start a story too soon, it doesn't necessarily feel natural.
So that's a conscious choice you're making in terms of approach, that you need to sort of hold it in your head until you're ready to put it down on paper.
Absolutely, yeah, I do. I don't, you know, sometimes I have the urge to do it, but I won't allow myself to it. I try to continue to just work through whatever I'm thinking about to see if it continues to hold me.
And how formed then is the story? And in particular, I'm interested in the characters. So do you know what's going to happen to them by the end of the story, or it evolves as the writing evolves?
Typically, it evolves. I mean, occasionally I'll start a story knowing the ending or having a sense of the ending, but it's pretty rare. Most of the time I have absolutely no idea. I have no idea where it necessarily is going to lead, but I have a sense of the beginning and the general tone of the story and the focus of the story.
So in a typical short story, and that's the book that I read of yours last summer, I think most of the short stories were maybe 4 or 5 sort of typewritten, if you will, script pages. How many hours would you say would go into a typical short story?
Several months at minimum. I don't think I've ever really completed a story and had it published in less than 3 months. So some stories will take me 6 months to a year, but usually I'm working on other things. I'll stop if I'm having trouble with it, and I'll move on to something else. But sometimes the whole process from beginning to end can be pretty long.
How have you evolved as a writer since, not quite since middle school or high school, but in more of your professional career?
Well, I think of a lot of it is related to the fact that I'm living on the East Coast. I find myself, as I mentioned before, writing a great deal about Texas, and I think that I feel as if I've found kind of my subject matter, at least at this time in my life. I was writing about a variety of things, but with no real thematic focus early on. But I'm curious in writing about Texas from the perspective of someone who no longer lives there.
And how has your view then of your home state changed since you started to pick it up thematically in your work?
Well, I mean, I'm disappointed in the state in a number of, in a number of areas politically, culturally to a certain degree. I mean, I have a love-hate relationship with Texas. There's plenty that I love, but there's plenty that disgusts me, and open carry law certainly doesn't make me happy. And so I tend to, I think that's reflected in my fiction. There's what I like about Texas comes through, but plenty of what I don't like comes through as well.
What are you working on now?
I'm working on a collection of link stories all set in an imaginary town in West Texas, a very small town.
And is there some appeal of West Texas specifically? Is it the mythology of West Texas, or that West Texas doesn't quite get the play, perhaps, of other areas in the state?
A combination of all of that. My parents are from West Texas, and so I used to go to West Texas quite a bit as a child. And West Texas is just a very desolate, unpopulated place except for a few cities. It's very flat, and to most people it's pretty unappealing. But I like it, and like as we tend to like places that we associate with family and childhood and so forth. And it also looks kind of like the quintessential Texas. I'm not particularly interested in the cities of Texas, which are fairly generic for the most part.
So in our final moments, what are you reading now? What's on your nightstand that you look forward to getting home to pick up?
I'm actually rereading books in preparation for a grad course that I'm teaching this summer. I'm teaching a course on post 9/11 fiction, so I'm rereading Amy Waldman's The Submission. I'm trying to decide which 9/11 books I'm going to choose to teach.
Well, I will go out and put that on my Kindle. Kevin Grauke, thank you very much.
Thank you.
From LaSalle University, this has been Academic Matters.